Everything changed the night my own parents looked me in the eyes and decided I was no longer worth keeping around. They did not scream because they had lost control. They spoke with the calm confidence of people who believed they were absolutely right. By the time I walked out of that house carrying a single duffel bag, they had already erased me from the future they imagined for our family. 3 weeks later, they stepped into a downtown office tower for an important business meeting and found my name engraved across the glass door of the executive suite. The look on their faces was something I will never forget for the rest of my life. My name is Madison Hayes, and I was 32 years old when my parents officially labeled me the family failure. Looking back, I cannot honestly say I was surprised. That judgment had been building for years, one criticism at a time. My parents believed success could be measured by diplomas hanging on walls, expensive job titles, and careers that impress neighbors during backyard barbecues. If something looked prestigious from the outside, they respected it. If it could not be explained in a single impressive sentence, they dismissed it without another thought. My older brother, Logan, was everything they admired. He had earned advanced degrees, climbed the corporate ladder at an impressive pace, and carried himself with the polished confidence of someone who always knew the right thing to say. My mother proudly shared every promotion he received as if it were a family holiday. My father never missed an opportunity to remind relatives how disciplined Logan had always been. Whenever my name entered the conversation, it was usually followed by an uncomfortable silence before someone changed the subject. It was as though my life had become the example of what not to do. The truth was far more complicated than anyone cared to discover. I had enrolled in college just like everyone expected, but halfway through my junior year I realized my heart was no longer in the classroom. Every spare moment was spent working on an idea that refused to leave my mind. I had started designing a software platform from the tiny apartment I rented near campus. It began with late nights, borrowed equipment, and endless cups of cheap coffee. I was not chasing an easy shortcut, I was chasing something I genuinely believed could solve a problem businesses faced every single day. When I finally decided to leave college and devote myself completely to the company, my parents treated it as if I had thrown my future into a fire. They never asked to see what I was building, they never wanted a demonstration or an explanation. In their minds, dropping out meant giving up. Nothing I said afterward could separate those two ideas. Every conversation ended the same way, with lectures about responsibility, wasted potential, and the importance of finishing what I started. After a while, I stopped trying to defend myself because every explanation sounded like another excuse to people who had already reached their verdict. Meanwhile, life quietly moved forward. The software improved. One client became 5 became 20. Small contracts turned into larger ones, and larger ones brought referrals I never expected. I hired my first employee before I even felt ready to manage another person. A year later, that tiny team had doubled. Then it doubled again. Every new milestone arrived with another challenge, another sleepless week, and another reminder that building something meaningful required more determination than any classroom had ever demanded. While my parents imagined I was drifting through life without direction, I was spending every waking hour trying to keep up with a company that was growing faster than I had ever imagined. The strange part was that hiding my success had never been my goal. In the beginning, I actually wanted to share every victory with them. I wanted to tell them about the first major contract, the first office space, and the first employee who trusted me enough to leave a stable job and join my little startup. Each time I tried to bring up work, though, the conversation somehow returned to college degrees or respectable careers. Eventually, I realized they were not listening because they had already decided what my story was supposed to be. Since they believed they knew everything, they never bothered asking a single real question. Years passed that way. My business expanded quietly while family gatherings became harder to endure. Every holiday felt like sitting through another performance, where Logan played the successful son and I played the cautionary tale. My parents never seemed embarrassed by the comparisons. In fact, they almost enjoyed making them. They spoke about discipline as if only one of us possessed it. They praised sacrifice without recognizing the countless nights I spent sleeping on office couches, skipping vacations, and risking every dollar I had to keep my company alive. Their version of success came wrapped inside expensive suits and framed certificates. Mine was hidden behind countless invisible hours no one ever noticed. Despite everything, I never stopped loving my family. That was probably my biggest weakness. A small part of me kept hoping they would eventually ask about my life with genuine curiosity instead of criticism. I imagined my father sitting across from me one day and saying he wanted to understand what I had built. I pictured my mother asking whether I was happy instead of whether I regretted leaving school. Those conversations never happened. Instead, every visit followed the same exhausting pattern until I could almost predict every sentence before it left their mouths. Everything finally came crashing down during a Sunday dinner that was supposed to be ordinary. My parents had invited several relatives over, including my aunt and uncle, and everyone gathered around the dining table sharing food and casual conversation. For a little while I believed we might actually survive the evening without becoming the topic of discussion. I smiled, helped clear dishes, and listened while everyone talked about vacations, work, and family news. Then my aunt looked at me with a warm smile and asked the simplest question anyone could imagine. She wanted to know what I had been doing lately. Before I could answer, my mother laughed softly and waved her hand as if dismissing the question altogether. She told everyone they were still trying to figure that out themselves. Several relatives laughed politely, assuming it was harmless teasing. I forced a smile even though I felt my stomach tighten. My father leaned back in his chair with an expression I recognized all too well. It was the same look he wore whenever he was about to teach someone a lesson. He praised Logan for working hard, earning respect, and building a real career before turning his attention directly toward me. Logan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even he looked uneasy about where the conversation was heading. But he remained silent. My father said some people spent years chasing dreams while others spent those same years creating stable futures. He claimed responsibility meant finishing what you started instead of abandoning difficult paths halfway through. Every sentence sounded less like advice and more like a public performance, designed to embarrass me in front of the entire family. I stayed quiet because arguing would only make the situation worse. But my silence seemed to encourage him even more. My mother slowly shook her head with obvious disappointment spread across her face. She said I had been blessed with every opportunity imaginable and somehow managed to waste all of them. She talked about unrealized potential as though my life had become one long series of failures. Around the table, nobody seemed to know where to look. My aunt stared down at her plate while my uncle quietly sipped his drink without saying a word. The room felt painfully small, and every second stretched longer than the one before it. Then my father crossed a line I never believed he would cross. He looked directly at me and said I would never measure up to my brother because I had chosen the easy road instead of earning real success. His voice remained calm, but the words landed harder than any shout ever could. He called me uneducated trash and said our family deserved better than someone who had thrown away every opportunity placed in front of them. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Even the relatives who usually agreed with my parents looked genuinely shocked by what they had just heard. I waited for him to realize what he had said. I expected at least a flicker of regret or hesitation. Instead, he folded his arms and stared back at me as if daring me to challenge him. When I still said nothing, he told me that if hearing the truth upset me so much, maybe I should stop living under his roof. He had no idea I was only staying there temporarily while renovations on a luxury penthouse I had recently purchased were being completed. I had never mentioned it because no one had ever shown enough interest to ask where I planned to move next. My mother nodded in agreement without the slightest hesitation. She said perhaps leaving was exactly what I needed if I ever hoped to grow up and take responsibility for my life. There was no discussion after that. No attempt to calm the situation. No one stood up for me. Logan looked as though he wanted to speak, but the words never came. I realized in that moment that defending myself would change absolutely nothing. They had built an entire version of me inside their minds, and no amount of truth could compete with years of assumptions. Without raising my voice, I quietly pushed back my chair and walked upstairs. Every step felt strangely peaceful, because something inside me had finally stopped fighting. I packed a few clothes into a worn duffel bag, zipped it shut, and carried it downstairs without rushing. My parents watched from the living room without offering another word. I paused at the front door, looked around the house where I had spent so many years, chasing approval that never seemed to come, and finally understood there was nothing left to explain. I walked outside, closed the door behind me, and drove away, knowing that this time I would never come back for permission to be proud of the life I had already built. The morning after I left, I woke up in a place that finally felt like it belonged to me. My penthouse had only recently finished its renovations, and although a few workers were still putting the finishing touches on the furniture, it already felt more like home than the house I had just left behind. As I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, I realized something unexpected. I was not angry anymore. I was exhausted. Years of trying to earn my parents' approval had drained me far more than building a multi-million-dollar company ever had. Walking out of their house had hurt, but it had also lifted a weight I had been carrying for most of my adult life. Instead of replaying the argument over and over, I buried myself in work. That was where I had always found peace. Every morning started before sunrise with strategy meetings, product reviews, and conversations with department leaders spread across different cities. Our company had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I first began. Coding alone inside a cramped apartment, hundreds of employees now depended on the decisions I made every day. New investors wanted meetings almost weekly, and our expansion into several major markets was moving faster than expected. I no longer spent my days wondering whether the business would survive. My focus had shifted toward making sure it kept growing without losing the culture we had worked so hard to build. 3 weeks passed without a single phone call from my parents. I never reached out, and neither did they. At first I checked my phone more often than I cared to admit, expecting at least one message asking whether I was all right. Nothing came. Eventually I stopped looking. The silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. It confirmed what I had already begun to accept. They believed they had been right to throw me out. As painful as that realization was, it also gave me permission to stop waiting for them to change. Around that same time, our executive team finalized plans for one of the biggest partnership events in company history. We had spent months negotiating with several national firms, and the presentation would introduce long-term expansion plans to potential partners, investors, and corporate clients. It was the kind of event that could shape the next chapter of our business. Since I personally handled many of the largest negotiations, I was scheduled to lead the presentation myself. My assistant coordinated invitations, finalized schedules, and confirmed attendance from every guest on the list. I barely glanced at the names because I trusted my team completely. What I did not know was that one of the invited companies employed a senior manager who happened to work closely with my brother, Logan. He had spoken highly of the opportunity and encouraged several key people within his network to attend, including my parents. To them, it sounded like an exciting chance to meet the leadership behind one of the fastest growing software companies in the Midwest. The invitation described impressive growth, ambitious expansion plans, and an opportunity to connect with the executive team. Naturally, they accepted without the slightest idea of who had built the company they were so eager to learn about. The morning of the event arrived with the kind of energy that always reminded me why I loved entrepreneurship. Executives filled the lobby long before the first meeting began. Investors greeted one another over fresh coffee while assistants hurried between conference rooms making final preparations. The glass tower buzzed with quiet confidence as sunlight reflected across polished marble floors. My office overlooked nearly the entire city, but I barely noticed the view as I reviewed financial reports and rehearsed the final details of my presentation with the leadership team. Several floors below, my parents stepped through the revolving doors wearing their nicest business clothes. My father straightened his jacket while my mother admired the elegant lobby, quietly commenting that successful companies always carried a certain atmosphere. A receptionist welcomed them warmly, confirmed their names, and handed them visitor badges before inviting them to follow her upstairs. They thanked her politely, completely unaware that every step was bringing them closer to a truth they never imagined possible. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking downtown Chicago. They followed the receptionist down a quiet hallway lined with modern artwork and private offices occupied by senior executives. Every office displayed a name, etched neatly across the glass beside an impressive title. My parents glanced around with obvious admiration, occasionally whispering to each other about how accomplished everyone must be to work there. The receptionist eventually stopped outside the largest corner office at the end of the hallway. Both of them looked toward the glass door at the exact same moment. Their footsteps came to an immediate stop. My father narrowed his eyes as if he believed he had read the name incorrectly. My mother stared without blinking, her lips slowly parting in complete disbelief. Across the glass, engraved in polished silver letters, were the words they never expected to see. Madison Hayes, Chief Executive Officer. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. My father looked back toward the receptionist, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. He quietly asked whether they were standing in the right place. The receptionist smiled politely and glanced at her tablet before reassuring him that everything was correct. She explained that the presentation would begin shortly and that Miss Hayes was already inside preparing for the meeting. My mother whispered that there had to be another Madison Hayes somewhere in the company because the alternative simply made no sense. Without realizing the storm she was about to walk them into, The receptionist smiled again and gently opened the office door. I was standing near the conference table reviewing a stack of notes while speaking with my chief operating officer. Hearing the door open, I looked up instinctively. Our eyes met instantly. Every sound in the room seemed to disappear as recognition settled across their faces. My mother looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. My father remained frozen in place, staring at me with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief and finally to complete shock. I offered the same calm smile I gave every guest who entered my office. "Good morning, thank you for joining us today." My voice remained steady, but inside I could hardly believe fate had arranged a moment this surreal. Before either of them could respond, several investors and executives entered behind them, filling the conference room with conversation. The opportunity for awkward explanations disappeared immediately as everyone took their seats and prepared for the presentation. For the next hour, I spoke with the confidence that had taken years to earn. I outlined our company vision, explained future expansion plans, answered difficult financial questions without hesitation, and introduced the leadership team responsible for turning impossible goals into measurable results. Executives beside me presented market projections while investors praised our growth and long-term strategy. Several partners shared stories about how our software had transformed their operations, and one board member proudly announced that our employee count had recently passed 700. Throughout the entire presentation, I noticed my parents sitting quietly near the back of the room. Neither of them interrupted once, they simply watched, listened, and slowly realized that every assumption they had made about my life had collapsed before their eyes. When the meeting finally ended, guests gathered their materials while conversations filled the room. Investors shook my hand, business leaders thanked me for the presentation, and several potential partners requested follow-up meetings. One by one, everyone filtered into the hallway until only 3 people remained inside the conference room: my parents and me. The silence felt completely different from the one at our family dinner. Back then it had been filled with judgment. This time it was filled with reality. My mother looked around my office once more before turning toward me. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. She quietly asked why I had never told them about any of this. I almost smiled, not because the question amused me, but because it revealed how little they understood what had really happened. I told her I had tried for years. Every time I wanted to share something exciting, the conversation had been cut short by another lecture about college, another comparison to Logan, or another reminder that people without degrees rarely succeeded. Eventually I realized they were more interested in the story they had created than the truth standing in front of them. Neither of them interrupted as I continued speaking. I explained that they had never once asked what I was building, how my business worked, whether I enjoyed my work, or even whether I was happy. They had judged an unfinished chapter and convinced themselves they already knew the ending. My father slowly lowered his head. The confidence that had filled his voice during family dinners was gone. In its place stood a man confronting the painful consequences of years spent misunderstanding his own daughter. Just then the office door opened again, and Logan stepped inside after receiving an urgent call from one of the guests. He looked around the room, took one glance at the office bearing my name, and smiled with quiet understanding. He admitted he had always believed there was more to my story than anyone realized. Looking back and forth between our parents and me, he let out a soft laugh and said, "Everything finally made sense." Hearing those words broke the tension for the first time all morning, and I found myself laughing too. My father slowly stepped forward until he stood across the conference table from me. He admitted that he had judged me without ever trying to understand me. He confessed that he had mistaken education for wisdom and appearances for achievement. My mother apologized as well, tears filling her eyes, as she admitted that she had spent so many years comparing her children that she had forgotten each person follows a different path. Their words were sincere, and I appreciated the courage it took to say them, but they could not erase years of rejection. They could only acknowledge that those years had happened. As they prepared to leave, my mother stopped at the doorway and quietly said she was proud of me. Those words had once been everything I wanted to hear. Years earlier they would have healed wounds I carried every day. Standing inside the office I had built through sacrifice, failure, persistence, and belief, they felt different. I thanked her sincerely because I no longer needed those words to define my worth. I had already discovered something much more valuable. After they walked away, I stood alone beside the window overlooking the city that had witnessed every step of my journey. The office outside quickly returned to its normal rhythm as employees hurried between meetings and phones began ringing again. Business moved forward because life always does. I realized my greatest achievement had never been becoming the chief executive of a successful company. It was learning to stop measuring my value through someone else's approval. Success was never about proving my parents wrong. It was about building a life so meaningful that their opinion no longer determined how I saw myself. Ironically, the moment they finally saw me for who I truly was the exact moment I had stopped needing them to. That was the greatest victory of all.